pronunciation. The proper pronunciation of my name is Ifeomo.
Ifeomo. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Ifeomo.
Hello, everyone.
Hey there. Yes, I'm in this group. I'm just, I forgot who's sharing their screen. I mean, I can do it. Okay.
Do you have it, Kelsey, or do you want me to pull it up?
It's not letting me.
I can try really quick.
Perfect. Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, oops, wrong button. Should be more fluent in Google Slides by now. But welcome. We are really excited to have you join our class. So this is a group of students who put the questions together. We all watched the lecture, and then we gathered a couple times on Zoom just to talk about main ideas and what we thought was most and what we wanted to most glean from you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelsey. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I will be monitoring the chat as much as I can while I'm sharing screen. So if other folks have questions, I can gather them and share them once we're done with the main questions. Now, Kelsey.
Cool. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, so we're doing our presentation on Ifeomo Ebo. Obviously, you're here right now. Thank you for being here. We wanted to just do like a quick introduction about a little bit about you. She's an urban designer and planning strategist, got her degrees from Cornell and MIT, which is super cool. And maybe not most importantly, but founding director of the Creative Urban Alchemy, which is a design firm, which we're going to get more into in the next slide. Ifeomo's worked on a lot of different projects, from architecture to urban revitalization and neighborhood development, all with kind of a focus on racial and social cultural equity in her projects, which is the focus, a lot of the focus for the Creative Urban Alchemy projects. And I did some looking into your website and I thought it was really cool. So I put a link to some of the publications because she's also an author and an award-winning photographer, which I thought was super cool. So if anyone's interested in looking more into that, there are some links in this slide, which we can send out to if you can't click on it. But thank you so much for being here. Next slide.
All right, and we've looked into a little bit of the work that you've done. So we know that you've had a hand in the Design Justice Summit, for those who don't know, is a nationwide coalition of 24 social impact architects and designers. The group has aims to share knowledge and develop design ideologies that address issues of injustice across the globe. The coalition practices design as justice with the intention of deconstructing power structures that have perpetuated injustice in the built environment, and the design justice platform that establishes a code of ethics for designers who will shape the environments for future generations. And then also I wanted to note the project Design as Protest, which is a collective of designers with the ambition to hold the design profession accountable for past wrongdoings through a commitment to the design justice demands, which are going to be listed on the screen. And I feel as designers, as we move forward into our future careers, we have an opportunity and responsibility to commit to these tenets.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and dive into the questions, and we just want you to speak on these questions. So a lot of your work and philosophy addresses the duality of power. So that's power as a resource for transformation and power used by one group as a weapon against another. So could you speak about your process of finding and developing your own power both personally and professionally, and 2, like ways in which those involved in the design process of public and community spaces can keep their power in check?
Really great question. And thank you for that. Thank you for the background on me. There's one thing I wanted to correct. I was not a part of planning of the Design Justice Summit. I know Brian Lee was the main organizer of that. I really wanted to attend, but I wasn't able to attend the weekend that it happened. But I am very much involved in design process, advising on projects when I can. Also the Associated Dark Matter University, which is more oriented towards academia, and the Black Space Urbanist Collective, which is, kind of like a sister organization to Design Protest. So I'm involved in the space, but I wanted to make sure not to take credit for work that I wasn't like instrumental in creating. Design Justice Summit was an amazing initiative, and yeah, I support it in any way that I can. Now to answer this question, my process in finding and developing my own power personally and or professionally. That's sure. So that first question is really quite interesting because I think it's taken me a while to find and develop my own power. And it really has started with finding my own voice. And it's really started with really solidifying the kind of impact I wanted to make on projects, the kind of projects I wanted to work on, and not wavering from that. Because when I started my career, design justice wasn't it wasn't a thing that people talked about. It certainly wasn't. Equity in design wasn't a thing. Diversity inclusion in the design fields or in design projects wasn't a thing that people were talking about. It was something I was passionate about. It's something I explored in design school. But I think there are a greater number of organizations and firms that are really hyper focused on it or are really looking for ways to incorporate it into their existing methods of working. So I think, in the beginning, I didn't really feel like I had a voice in that respect, but I think over time, as I've worked on projects and been very strategic about where I was gonna dedicate my efforts and really following my passions, I think is definitely a part of the process is, choosing my next career step, choosing my next project based on things that I'm passionate about, as opposed to a already clearly defined path. And so sometimes that's a balance that you have to make, is really deciding between, the typical, you graduate from school, you work for a big law firm, you work for a big design firm, you do your time, you get your license, versus, working for these organizations that are doing really meaningful and powerful work in communities that need that support. And I think back then it's like you had to make that choice and it was a tough one. Now I think it's a lot easier because you have a lot more firms that are doing and organizations that are doing really interesting and creative work in communities. So I think the more following my passion was a part of it. And then the next part is really finding my tribe. If you just focus on, the typical organizations, particularly in the architecture field, is the American Institute of Architects, or in the planning field is American Planning Association. If you just follow those key organizations, which is taking them time to really buy into and really get hip to this movement of design justice, of equity, in design. But I found that when I started to find these other kinds of organizations that are really centering equity and justice in their work, and I found my people there, like other architects and planners and urban designers that were just as passionate, qualified, got all the licenses and everything, like that is another way I was able to really hone in on my power, is when I found other people who were like-minded. And so organizations like Design Protest, Dark Matter University, Association for Community Design, I said Dark Knight University already. Black Space Urbanist Collective, creating new organizations and using those organizations as a platform to support and boost and amplify the message and people doing that work. So that has been a part of it too. So I think all of these different moves and strategies and approaches have really helped me find and develop my own power and feel confident in speaking on it, because I know I had a whole body of like other professionals and practitioners who were just like, yes, yeah, me too. So I think that's important too, is finding your tribe. Now, in terms of ways in which those involved in design process of public community spaces keep their own power in check. When you say power in check, what do you mean?
I think we were meaning, like being in position, being planners and being in these positions of power to help shape our communities. How can we ensure that the ways in which we go about doing that are not harmful?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like kind of like, even though we may develop our own power, how can we still maintain that we go about that, especially in the position of being a designer, being able to influence our communities and how they grow? Like, how can we make sure we're not being harmful with that power?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you look at the Black Space Manifesto, one of the principles is practice deep listening, or work with humility and deep listening. Hold on, let me read it so I say it for sure. Be humble learners who practice deep listening. And I have it on my wall because it's always helpful for me to look at it and make sure I'm holding myself accountable to these principles I co-created with others. I think historically in the design and planning fields, we're not really trained to operate with humility. We're trained to sort of be the ones that distribute power and sort of like hoard it and use it as we see fit, because property is power, land is power, and the planning of it, right? And so I think definitely that act of deep listening, which I find in studios that I'm teaching, is challenging, even for students to listen deeply to each other and not be critical of the information they're hearing, but think critically about how that information can influence the work that they're doing. And I think that is the work of keeping your power in check, recognizing that there are other experts in the room. They don't have a, landscape credentials or architecture credentials or planning credentials by their name, but they're qualified as a expert of the lived experience in that community. And so therefore their feedback and their expertise is just as important as yours. And so I think this is really one of the key ways that someone's power can be in check, but also just recognizing the power of others, I think, is important. And when you begin to recognize the power of others, that can be empowering. I'm not saying that you're going to give them power, but you're recognizing that they have their own power and acknowledging it at that table of, collaboration and engagement.
Great, thank you for that. The second question is, in an interview with Madame Architect and with the Designers Protest Movement, it seems like a core mission of yours is to transform the role of architects in society. And there's a need for architects to play a greater role of facilitating a design process that is very inclusive. How can we encourage designers to be more inclusive? Both the younger designers and the more experienced designers when designing spaces?
Another great question. And again, I will go to the Black Space Manifesto because there's so much. It took us a year to put that manifesto together. And the year-long process was after a year-long process working in historically Black community. trying to do some planning work there around cultural heritage. And then we crafted these set of manifesto principles to guide us in the work moving forward. And so, you know, one of the manifesto principles is to seek people at the margins. And I think that's really critical, especially when working in Black communities or working in communities of color. You can have a room that appears visually homogeneous, like a room full of Black people in a Black community, but not recognize that there are power dynamics there. There are marginalized voices there. There are differences that you may not see. And so it's important to acknowledge those types of, that potential for difference in a room that seems homogeneous, and seek them out, seek out those voices. Make sure you're not only listening to the loudest voice in the room, but, you know, be creative in ways that you're also tapping into the lived experience of the people who are not very loud in the room. That might mean that you're doing a poll, or you're doing a survey, or you're doing a mail-out ballot, or you're just finding some other way where people who are not comfortable with like shouting out in a community meeting, or, you know, debating on a particular topic in a design charrette workshop meeting, that there's space for other people to chime in. And so the ways to encourage designers is that you get your best project when you're actually involving as diverse as voices as possible, because you're really making sure that you're covering all your bases. There are so many times when I'm teaching a design studio and, like, you know, there's these designing all these spaces with all these magnificent stairs, and it's just like, there's a significant population that are not going to be able to enjoy your building because you have no way for them to get to the top floor. And that's real. And it's not just about people who are, you know, have physical challenges. It's people who also have baby carriages or can't, you know, have children. And so I think, you know, it definitely is. And really, when you have a inclusive design process that seeks people at the margins, you're able to get all that type of insight and feedback that can make your project so much richer.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is all really great. And I think ties in interestingly to the next question as well, which goes a little bit into your work in New York and with homeless populations as well. So that this question is, in cities such as New York, where spatial restrictions of homeless populations are becoming increasingly enforced, do you believe that the design of public space using the Safe Places, Active Spaces model has the potential to provide safe, beneficial accommodations for its communities while improving public perceptions of homelessness? And if so, if you have suggestions on how we as designers can help empower these communities to possibly integrate them into existing community spaces.
When you say these communities, are you talking about the like unhoused, the people who don't have homes?
Yes, I think, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So I would say, I mean, regarding that first question, so I believe that the design of public space has a potential to provide safe, beneficial accommodations for these communities. I think, first of all, yes, because, you know, you have a whole body of work that is like referred to as hostile architecture. I'm not sure if you guys have heard that term before. There's like a whole website that speaks on hostile architecture. And I think that's something that definitely needs to be addressed, because that doesn't recognize that public spaces should be for everyone. And it really creates a stigma around homelessness. And it's just like, you can't just go in and tear down encampments and not assume that that's that problem, and not assume that the problem is just going to go away because you tore down that encampment. Like, you need to really rectify with that situation. And I also don't believe, you know, creating spaces for people to live on the streets is a good solution at all. Like, If there's supportive housing necessary, if there's mental health support necessary, then those things need to be ramped up and not just put it on people who don't have homes, because the presence of it is a clear indicator that there's an issue in the city. And so I think the Safe Places, Active Spaces model, it's not only about the design of space, it's also about transforming spaces in a way that you're building community, you're building networks, you're building support systems in the community, so that you're not thinking about safety as an issue that needs to be addressed by police, but you're thinking safety or the lack of safety as an outcome of a deeper seated issue in the community that needs to be addressed with methods that perhaps don't even deal with crime. They deal more with health, they deal more with culture, they deal more with economics, like some of the underlying root causes in a community that lead someone to go into a life of crime. I mean, you can even see with, I'm not sure if you guys heard of the shooting that happened in the train station in Brooklyn. What was it, 2 days ago? I'm actually in Brooklyn. Got to say I'm on the unceded lands of the Lenape people, but also known as Brooklyn. And when I did some research on what happened in the train station, and there was all these reports on the shooter and how he had this track record. He had this like YouTube channel where he would just do some ramblings and stuff, and he would talk about his mental health issues, and he would talk about feeling like he's doing everything he's supposed to do, doing his work, paying his taxes and everything, but people still smack him in the face. And for me, a lot of his it felt like an outcry. It felt like, here is someone from a marginalized community who's continuing to be marginalized, continue to experience microaggressions in his life, who continuously experiences discrimination and has no outlet, has felt like he had no other outlet but to do something to hurt other people. And granted, he has mental health issues at all, so that's just some compounding on top of just these feelings of stress and aggravation and frustration and no support anywhere. And so I think that is really what the underlying issue when we're thinking about safe places, active spaces, is really how do you cultivate space in a way that supports people in other issues in their life. So whether it's mental health, there's lots of research connecting key parts of open space and public spaces and how it impacts mental health, how it impacts the economy, how it impacts physical health. So these are the types of research that cities need to be doing and really begin to implement them in their public infrastructure, while they're also dealing with the other stuff, like ramping up their mental health support programs, ramping up their supportive housing programs, because they all need to work together. We can't just rely completely on like a physical space solution. So, that for me is the answer to the first question, is really acknowledging that there's a problem and transforming spaces in a way that is supportive rather than, punitive, rather than pushing people away and being hostile. So how can designers help to empower the communities and possibly integrate them into existing community spaces? I think it's being a champion, being an advocate for what their needs are in the design process, depending on who your client is, because your client could be a city agency and that's a space. It could be a developer. That's another space of advocacy. I find that, I spent 2 years working for the Department of Housing Preservation Development. And, we develop affordable housing across the cities. And, we work a lot with private developers. They're our partners on projects. And those private developers work with architects. And I found that those architects, when working with developers, are in a really great influential space, particularly when working on affordable housing, because they can influence the kinds of projects that developers create in terms of the programming, if it's mixed use, what's the use that's going to be on the ground floor, and the developers can work out financially how to make it work. So there's a great sort of space of influence when designing housing, particularly when you're working with developer or even working with a city, to be able to influence what other programs can happen in that building to support that community. And I think this is where the space of empowerment lies, is really being an advocate in those spaces where community doesn't reach.
Yeah, no, thanks. There's so much to think about there. I have so many follow-up questions, but I think we'll keep going and have space at the end for some more open discussion. But yeah, really appreciate all that. So I think for the last one we have before opening it up is about this idea of cultivating wealth in spaces. So you speak about designing spaces in ways that can generate wealth for the community, with cultivate wealth as another one of the principles in the Blackface Manifesto. So we'd love to hear a bit about what it's looked like for you to incorporate wealth generation into the design process and how you address that relationship between wealth generation, but also having it not lead to like displacement and some of the negative pieces that can bring.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in the Blackspace Manifesto, cultivate wealth, that principle in particular was talking about wealth, not only about financial resources, but about time, talent, and treasure. Because there are so many ways that we can be wealthy, and it's not only just like money in the bank, but it's also like there's a lot of talent in a community, and that just wants to be, that needs nurturing to flourish, and they need spaces to nurture that type of talent. And so that's one way that wealth can be cultivated is through the creating spaces for the cultivation of talent. Treasure is the financial aspect of it. There's also assets in the community. There are key places that people feel connected to. They are attached to a community because of these key spaces that are in their neighborhood, but maybe those spaces are in jeopardy of leaving. Like oftentimes, when you think about gentrification, there may be tools in place to stabilize housing so people don't leave, but there aren't any tools to stabilize businesses. So those mom and pop shops, once that building gets redeveloped, they get kicked out and they can't afford to return because Starbucks now has both of their shops is torn down for a whole Starbucks or a whole Target or a whole, name the next, franchise. And I think that's a part of it too, is, thinking creatively about how small businesses can stay in place. And that can be done through design. That can be, sometimes I teach my students about like, when thinking about mixed use, the ground floor use, it doesn't have to be one tenant, one occupant for the whole space. The space can be broken down to have multiple businesses in there. I'm certainly seeing models like that. And what that does is it creates spaces small enough for smaller entrepreneurs to be able to have a space for themselves that they can start their business or keep their businesses going. And then they share resources. So I think that kind of like shared resource space is also a way of cultivating wealth, because you're creating opportunities for entrepreneurs to have businesses in their community and they don't get displaced. So yeah, I mean, and then the third part of the cultivate wealth for the Blackspace Manifesto is about time, cultivating a wealth of time. And I think this is just, time to dream, time to think, time to ponder, imagine, reimagine. And that's what the design process is. And it really goes hand in hand with the other Blackspace principle, which is move at the speed of trust. And it's acknowledging that, in communities that have been historically marginalized, they've been operating in this way where people come in, do these charrettes and workshops. They never hear anything. They whip things up really quickly, and everything is just moving at a pace that's just causes them to now no longer have trust in the people who oversee those processes. So I think, you know, really pausing and creating space in a process where people can first maybe even deal with trauma, because sometimes trauma can get in the way of being able to be generative in ideas. So creating space for that kind of like trauma and grief, and just listening, but through by being humble listeners, so that you can create a new canvas for dreams and visions to be projected onto. But that space needs to be created, because that dreaming process, that imagination, that collective imagining, it starts to, you know, generate new dreams for people, new thoughts they never thought before, especially when you have the right kinds of questions, like the kinds of questions that you guys have been asking me. It will cause people to think thoughts that they've never thought to think before. And so I think that is important in just cultivating time to dream, because particularly in marginalized communities, people are not asking them about dreaming. They're just like, here's the thing we did. Do you like it or not? So yeah, I think, and so this relationship between wealth generation and displacement, I think all of the strategies that I've mentioned are really about wealth generation from a grassroots level. Like, how do you create opportunities for the existing talents to thrive? How do you create opportunities for existing or new entrepreneurs to form? How do you create opportunities for existing residents to dream and co-create and reimagine? And I think that is the key to addressing what is the unique set of wealth that needs to be generated for that particular community, because each community has a different kind of wealth that needs to be generated, or gaps in wealth. And that's where that space lies. You know, displacement happens when you're designing spaces that are not meant for the existing population. You're thinking about this new population that's coming in, and you're doing it in a way that has no acknowledgement of the existing financial challenges, you know, cultural challenges, needs, you know, all of that. And sometimes it's not perfect. I mean, I've spent time working with the Housing Development Agency in New York City, and just by the fact that we're a housing development agency, we come into a community saying, hey, we're developing housing. You want to give us some thoughts on that? Like, there's no collective conversation about, what do you want on this site? We've already decided it's housing. And we're asking them not a question about what do you want to see here, but, you know, what does it look like? So I think that's, at times, that can be part of the problem. And, you know, we're working on using, you know, addressing different ways of addressing that, trying to find different ways of addressing the displacement by really focusing on stabilizing housing in the community. But I think in terms of design, you need to really think about what is the existing culture of the place, and making sure that the new designs are really tapping into the amazing existing assets, creative assets, you know, cultural heritage of the community, so people can see themselves in the new work.
Yeah, that's great. And I think actually, well, okay, first we have some follow-up questions, but I guess want to open it up to the class to see if anyone has any follow-ups or other things on your mind, and then otherwise we can share a few more that kind of relate to what we've been talking about as well.
Yeah, I'd say open it up first. So if anybody has a question, go for it. I've got a bunch, but I'll see Ifeomo in a couple of weeks. So
Can I, this is a quick question, but I think that I read or I heard in the video we watched that the graphic design of the Black Space Manifesto, like the points, the illustrations that went with it, the process of developing those was really interesting. I think, was that when you had people bring in, you had like young people or people from the community bring in like personal items that meant a lot to them, and then you reinterpreted them for this manifesto? And is that correct, or am I?
You're combining two different
Okay.
projects. So the process that you're talking about was a process that we used in working with Sasaki and this organization called Black Girl Code, or G Code, I think is what it's called, where this woman works with young Black women in Boston who are interested in learning coding. And she bought a house and is going to create the house into a home and sort of like workforce development center for young Black women interested in coding. So they would live there and they learn coding and then get jobs in coding. So she wanted to make sure that the principles were embedded in this redesign that Sasaki was doing. So what we did was we had the young women bring in sentimental artifacts. So things that made them feel safe, made them feel whole, made them feel affirmed. And that became a part of a conversation around what kind of principles should be created for the reimagining of this space, the interior design of this space and the landscape design of this space that taps into the meaning behind some of these sentimental artifacts, or the texture or the color or the pattern behind some of the sentimental artifacts. And that became a part of their process of developing an interior design and a landscape architecture scheme. And so the process for, I would say it's not unlike the process for developing the Black Space Manifesto. As I mentioned before, we spent a year working in Brownsville, which is a historically Black community in Brooklyn. And as we spent that year working in that community, we knew we wanted to do community engagement differently. We wanted to disrupt the existing process that's very linear. It's not cyclical. You sort of just like do the process and you don't go back and try it again. And so we devised a process that was very cyclical and iterative, that we would constantly sort of like connect with community, brainstorm and create some ideas, test them out, and again, connect with community again as we kept refining what was going to be created. And so we went in working in Brownsville without an intention on what the final product was going to be. And so our ways of operating and our methodologies during that year, figuring things out, became a set of principles that we then spent a year working with all of our colleagues and board members in Black space, refining it and really thinking through, okay, what principles are the most profound? What types of reading are we doing in the world that can help us refine these principles even more? One book created by an author, the book is called Emergent Strategy by, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name.
Adrienne Marie Brown.
Marie Brown.
Yes, Adrienne Marie Brown. That was an amazing book of just really great influence of our manifesto, particularly the principle of moving at the speed of trust. And really just like it opens your mind as to different ways that people can work together. And so when we then had our principles set up, and we're just like this, it needs some sort of like visual look to it so people can connect to it in as designers. And we hired a graphic designer, and we went through another lengthy process of going back and forth. And so there was a few things that we said at the base level when to think about these graphic symbols per each principle. First is like we wanted it to be something that when people saw it, they can definitely say, oh, this is something that's Black oriented or in a Black aesthetic. And so we were inspired by the Adinkra symbols in Ghana, which are these powerful, graphic representations of proverbs and stories, really. Each symbol represents sort of something that's very meaningful for the culture and society. And people often will use them in carvings in their homes, you know, all over the city of Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana, you'll see the symbols. And so there's something quite spatial and design oriented. And so we were inspired by that. And so we went to the graphic designer with that understanding that we wanted to connect it to these Adinkra symbols. And so we went through this back and forth. And so the meaning behind each symbol is the principle itself. And so the charge for the graphic designer was to come up with a symbol that when you looked at it, it connected to the meaning of the symbol. So some, you know, parts of it may look like people coming together, it may look like plants flourishing, like these are all just like concepts that are very much connected to the ideas embedded in the manifesto. And yeah, that's how that came to be. And there are so many, we were amazed. We released it February 2018. And we were really amazed with how it's really gone viral. There's so many organizations, you know, art museums like Guggenheim or Oakland Museum or the Museum of Modern Art in New York City that have really latched on to these principles, and just like the graphic presentation of them, you know, and have had them in exhibition. So it's been really rewarding to see how this work that we did collectively, you know, through a process of engagement, how it landed for people and how it's still supporting practitioners in their work.
I appreciate you clearing that up for me. Both are very beautiful processes, so I'm glad to learn about those. Thank you.
Ifeomo, you got time for maybe one or two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Appreciate it. Laura, I know you got a question.
Yeah, I think something that's come up a bunch in your responses have been this whole idea of moving at the speed of trust. And that's something our group was talking about a lot in like pulling together our questions. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about like the challenges you face in achieving this when you're working with municipalities or other governments who maybe don't have a great rapport with the communities, and what techniques have proven to be successful in approaching that process and trying to mend those relationships.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, I think on all sides, whether it's private sector or public sector, that there's a challenge in moving at the speed of trust. And so I'll start by saying, I think when I've advised mayors on this, and I did one project where I was advising mayor of Union City, Georgia. And you know, he was really interested in coming up with strategies around this Latinx community there. And that was one of the things I proposed. I proposed a process of placemaking that moved at the speed of trust. And they were open to it. It was a bit challenging. I mean, I think because they were at the beginning of their process, they were a lot open to it. And because they had a lot of mistrust in this community, but with people feeling like, you know, there were undocumented residents in this community, and they were afraid of, you know, being attacked by ICE agents, or, you know, being, you know, sent back to their homelands. So it was a very sensitive issue for him in engaging with this community and not doing it overboard to the point where people will feel threatened. So rather than say, oh, you need to take a long time with this process, I helped them develop a process of working with communities to create place, to do placemaking projects, similar to some of the projects I presented in the presentation, because each of those projects require working with communities to develop action plans, thinking through how community is going to be stewards of those spaces, co-creating with community takes time. When you just hire a consulting firm to come in and just design a thing and move on, that stuff can be done quickly. But if you can bring in a firm to come in and co-create with community so that they are authors and stewards and maintainers of a space, then that is inevitably moving at the speed of trust. So I think with governments, it requires that sort of due diligence. Now, when working in the housing agency, that has been more challenging because we come into a community and already have determined that the project is going to be housing. But we are thinking through what are ways that we can be iterative in our approaches to engaging with community. And I think that's also part of the moving at the speed of trust. It's not just that you had a workshop and session, you sort of like take that feedback, you create your report and your design strategies, and then maybe you report back. And maybe you don't, because you don't have time. Excuse me, but being more strategic about how does community get involved in that process of making, even if you're coming into a community and you've already decided what the product is going to be, thinking through how you can be more intentional with working with community to craft that project more effectively, involving them in the process, making sure that every time you engage with them, you're giving them just as much information as they are giving you. And that information you give them can be very powerful. It can be it can support them in advocating for themselves in other spaces. So I hope did that answer your question?
Yeah, those are great examples. Thank you so much.
Okay, I see Megan has a question here. What advice do I give to students that are passionate about equity and design? How do we begin to educate ourselves and act on this knowledge that we can make a positive change? I mean, you start by having a professor like Kofi Boom, one of the nation's experts on that topic, and looking at the work of other great practitioners who are also doing that work. Liz Ogbu in California, you've got Brian Lee in New Orleans, you've got Jay Pitter in Canada, you've got so many, Justin Moore in New York. There's so many. You participate in designers protests, you sign up to be a part of that organization so that you can co-create ideas with other practitioners who are passionate about it. You go to the Association for Community Design conferences. You sign up to be a member of the Association for Community Design because they have webinars, they have a lot of trainings on this subject matter. And these are organizations that are multidisciplinary. They're not just about architects or planners, they also have landscape architects on their board. And so they're really thinking about what are the intersections of these different disciplines. What else do you do? You look for, I think being a part of these organizations that are doing this work or championing this work and supporting it any way you can, it's a great space of learning. Absolutely. How do we get to educate ourselves? Yeah, I think definitely is, every year going to the Association for Community Design Conference, you're starting to see it more and more at the larger professional organizations like ASLA and AIA and APA. They're having content on this as well, because they're seeing that there's a growing body of the new emerging designers that really want to understand this stuff thoroughly. So I think that's some of the ways. There are fellowships out there too. I was going to say the Enterprise Fellowship. Enterprise is closing this year. There are no more. I don't remember if there are other fellowships up there. But the thing about Designers Protest, they actually have a I think a periodic announcement of seminars on their Instagram seminars and talks and fellowships and things like that, definitely follow that. And whenever you see a talk or conversation happening, go to that talk. Because it's a great space of learning.
I think that's gonna wrap us up for this evening. So I'd like to thank Ifeomo for her time and inspiration and incredible work.
Thank you for inviting me. This was great. I love the questions. It was a great conversation.
It was great. And of the list, Justin's got the money. So he's at Mellon Foundation now. So if you need some money, Justin Garrett Moore should be at the top of the list. The rest of us are chasing breadcrumbs, but he's got deep pockets now. So.
Right. And also follow the work that he is funding, like the Mellon Foundation through Justin, because Justin is in an inaugural position where they're thinking about placemaking. You know, look at where they're directing money, because they're giving 1 million here, 2 million there. Those are places where they're going to be looking for people to support development of those projects. So those are spaces where there's going to be opportunity for this type of thinking. And that's what's amazing about what Justin is doing, that he's creating more spaces for this type of thinking to find its way and be real.
That's right. Well, one thing I do admire very much about you is making space and institution building. So often with designers, we're not taught that. We're very competitive and siloed and individualistic, and you're the opposite. So a great role model to follow. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we're back. Other reflections on Ifeomo? Her presentation.
I thought it was great. Her answers to the questions were really insightful, and I really liked the follow-up on like how we can take action into like as students. So like all the resources she gave out. So I really enjoyed this talk.
I'm like impressed and inspired by her big time. She seems so like, her CV, like, I don't know, her resume is really impressive. So it's cool to see like the different ways our future as professionals, even though like I'm not a designer, I probably won't be in that world, but just like, I don't know, the projects that are happening and the things you can get involved with are really growing, and I don't know, very inspirational, her path. Also, does the Black space in Durham have anything to do with Black space, or are they separate?
Interesting enough, that's separate. So that's Pierce Freeline, son of Phil Freeline, who passed away, and Nina Freeline. And he designed that, I think, not knowing and not aware of this sort of concurrent activity happening. His focus is more on Afrofuturism, creativity, and technology. So they do a lot of really cool stuff, but their focus is a little bit different. But that's a good point. It's a good question. Sidebar, Pierce and Nina were the first mother and son, both nominated for Grammys in different categories ever happened this year. So if you watch the Grammys, they even co-presented a couple of awards this year on the Grammy stage. So the first family of Durham. Other reactions or reflections based on conversation with Ifeomo? Yes, thanks, Michaela. There is an exhibition of Phil's work at NCMA right now. So that's cool. It's cool that, there was a long period of time when Phil, before he got sick, didn't want anything to do with NC State, even though he's an alumni. He claimed MIT because that's where he got his graduate degree, but credit to the college and David Hill at leadership in the School of Architecture, where by the end, near the end of his life, he was willing to be more present and connect. So incredible person. So for people who don't know, along with David Adjaye and a few other partners, the designer of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., which is sort of his crowning achievement, the most visited Smithsonian in history. So an incredible legacy. Other comments? Well, one thing I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say something that in hearing everything she was saying, like how complex every issue is, and it's not just like the landscape, but it's like all the other factors. I think I just kept thinking like in our group and in class in general, like talking about like what falls on the back of designers and what relationships need to be formed. And I don't know, it was just like everything she was saying is so right. And then I'm from New York City originally. So like I have a lot of feelings and critiques about like government and leadership there. So it's like, oh, but like, so having designers in those other groups like become awesome and innovative is great and important, but also it almost like is giving this free ride to government officials in some ways. So like that balance of what relationships looks like and what landscape designers take on is just like an interesting
free ride. What do you mean by free ride?
Or maybe free riding was a little and our group last week, our like discussion group here was just talking about like what I feel like in other scenarios, it looks different ways of like nonprofits maybe having to like do the grunt work of like really helping communities while really it's like these larger systemic problems. And I think with design too, it's like now here, is it just designers having to do this, that like good on the ground work while it's really like maybe these larger systemic issues that the government should be addressing or looking out for people more that they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's reminding me of the conversation we're having about neoliberalism and the idea that in some cases, what is in the public interest for a lot of reasons, that public government, public entities where you actually vote for people and there's some sort of public accountability are kind of outsourcing that stuff to private firms and entrepreneurs and other folks with the assumption that they're more agile, current, and they have a real incentive to actually succeed as opposed to large public agencies, which are like turning battleships. They take forever to change direction and pivot. It's a really good question. I think that it's not realizing everybody in the class is in design, and that wasn't a requirement, and no disparaging components there, but every designer has an ego, right? They want you to believe that the way that they did it was the way to do it, and the way that they tell the story kind of confirmation bias. But I think that what's helped me sometimes just interacting with people is asking about when it didn't work, like an example of a failure and how you recovered from it. There's a whole wing of engineering in particular. There's a really famous bridge structural engineer at Duke who's got like 10 books on failure and learning from failure. So without that prompt, I think we want to talk about the sunny side of the street. I'm sure if Ifeomo had a chance to unpack the struggles they had in Bronzeville, which is a neighborhood in Chicago, that really gave birth to, the inadequacies, it revealed the inadequacies of the tools that they already had in terms of engagement in community, which was the prompt to, we got to come up with different principles and different philosophies, and different strategies and different takes. So in a way, Black space emerged because the tools that they were trained to use and they were using were completely wrong and off base. So in a way, in that story, it's communicating how they learned from, something that didn't work extremely well. But you raised a good point, Laura. I think that there's a good debate. I can't remember the author of the book. I'll send it later, but there's a book called Palaces for the People, which harkens back to City Beautiful era in cities and the attitude of investment in public infrastructure, that it wasn't just efficiency, but it was meant to inspire, be a symbol of really the power of democracy and of work. Now, this is with the caveat that all of the isms were present: sexism, racism, everything you can imagine at that particular time. But when you look at how particularly this country invested in simple stuff like bridges, libraries, museums, public parks, like it was beyond just the utility of that particular thing. It was sort of a communication of farther societal values, and in some ways that's not really an ethic right now. Folks seem to be a bit more pragmatic, or at least you're seeing the influence of globalization and the fact that with corporations in particular, really connecting authentically to individual places is not always the top priority. So, in the case of New York, and that would have been my question. You all asked such great questions, I didn't jump in, but one of them was, the growth imperative. So in a certain way, if you're practicing urban design and architecture in New York City, and increasingly where we are, with the growth imperative here, I think a lot of people think of designers in a football analogy like a quarterback. So, hold the ball, see the field, deliver the ball being the idea or the structure, and they can execute a play. But I think increasingly people are thinking of designers as more like really good safeties and defensive backs. Like the ball is already in the air and you kind of have to react and address it. So in these high pressure growth situations, really creative people have found these niches of, sort of being connectors between these big global forces and these local interests. That's an increasing lane. I suppose my hometown of Detroit, we're just a totally different dynamic, where you don't have those growth imperatives. And so you find more innovation in that regard, quite frankly, in what are known as legacy cities or places that don't have those growth imperatives, because there's more of an appetite for, experimentation, risk taking, trying new things. So it opens up the door to a really interesting set of conversations, and I hope that you have the ability to have those conversations moving forward about that. We don't want to reinforce the designers like the Avengers. I like the Avengers, but that ain't designers. There's a whole lot of other people out there.
Kofi, I have a quick question. Is there pushback towards these movements for design, equity, and justice? What is who or what, maybe it's not worth even discussing that but what does that look like?
That's a really good question. Something that you all may want to look into is Dark Matter University. I'll put a link in the chat. That was one of the institutions that Ifeomo talked about, but didn't come up in the chat. So it was born out of that designers protest. It turns out is going to go down in history as a really important sort of tipping point. Brian Lee led that from Co-Locate. You'll see him in the slides in a second. And out of that group of people who are frustrated with the way things are moving, these other institutions kind of grew, and they kind of extended from that. The Designers Justice Movement, later Dark Matter University. So, we'll keep it real for a second. If you are in an academic institution and you're trying to get tenure, and you're dealing with controversial topics that really challenge status quo, has a number of implications, right? One is research grants, peer-reviewed publications, all these sort of existing systems in some ways reinforce status quo thinking about things. So the ability to be successful as an academic who's focused on these particular issues is a huge challenge. So the topics alone, you're stepping into an arena where it's not celebrated. Clients. So, Ifeomo, I'm sure if she ran down the list of clients that Black Space serves or Co-Locate, Brandley, or other folks serve, many of them don't have the monetary resources to sustain a professional practice. And clients, including communities that actually do have the resources, skew a bit more conservative, right? So this idea of really challenging, identifying systems of power, dismantling the ones that are disproportionately impacting affected people and proposing new things is considered a risk. So on the professional front and academic front, there are all these systemic barriers. So these structures and these institutions that people have built, in spite of that, I think mark an important shift in terms of saying that we are able to have as much influence, we're able to have as much impact without going down these traditional channels. But all that comes with risk, a lot of risk. So I think there was, these events like coming through COVID, the murder of George Floyd, this past 2 years in particular, there's been sort of an exciting opportunity where people, are in this sort of shock, where they're, trying to figure out how to respond and react in a systemic way. These things created opportunities for many of the individuals that Ifeomo referenced and that we've referenced in this class, because people are hungering for, some solutions. But there's always that fear of retrenchment, right? That once the shock wears off, we go back to business as usual, all the stuff will get forgotten. I don't think it will. I think for some reasons they're aligned with sort of a sea change, a generational shift, your generation in particular, that sees government in a different way, sees entrepreneurship and work in a fundamentally different way, mobility, like the ability to connect to places and the willingness to locate based on your values in a different way. So I think it's here to stay. But I do think it's that everybody that she referenced and everything we've talked about, there's been tremendous risk associated with it. So, yeah. All right. We'll move on. Feel free to jump in. I won't take credit for much, but I will say one reason why I get along with all these people is the willingness to share space in a formal institution, to have these conversations, a safe space. Have worked with a number of them, so that idea of trust is what it is. So hopefully, it's being the last lecture. One thing that I hope is being able to interact with people who are really on the leading edge of a lot of these issues. Some of them unresolved, really complex, but your ability to be able to have a face-to-face, even on the screen, conversation with leaders is something I hope you take with you and I hope you continue. So as people that you're interested in or topics that you're interested in continue, I think anybody who's been in the class as a guest, that can be a way to open up a conversation. You could call or email any of these folks, say, hey, I saw you in class, can I follow up with something? They're actually really good people. No jerks this semester. There were a few jerks last year. No jerks this semester. So please, it's important to the broader education, to show those connections, that commitment. In that spirit, should talk about what I did last week. So my other job is president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. And we had our summit at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. This past weekend. The theme was Grounding the Green New Deal, Design Policy and Advocacy. Joe, who's on this call, was there with us and did a great job while he was there. Bringing it up for a few reasons. If nobody's been to the National Building Museum, that's it. And speaking of palaces for the people, that used to be the pension building. So they used to be the federal building used to get your retirement. Now look at that thing, right? So the amount of dignity conferred to people who celebrating their service. So that's the interior. And one of our missions was an exhibit that we'll talk about in a second, sort of mounting this exhibit. The event had a few hundred people in person and an equal number online. It was made up of a series of panels. We'll talk about the Green New Deal in a second and how this relates to this class and in terms of affecting massive change. But that panel, actually, the guy who's staring out into space in the brown jacket is Brian. So he's the guy that was being referenced in Ifeomo's presentation. The lady all the way on the right is Anne Winston Spurn, who we've talked about in this class as well. So the great creator of the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. And Billy Fleming, the director of the McCarg Center at Penn, is on the left as he's moderating the panel. The big thing, and the thing I want to leave you with is, as we're taking these topics on, what it's asking us is for our theories to change. And in the case of the Green New Deal, massive change. So not just a little bit of change, but catalytic change that deals with the challenges of today. The New Deal, for people who may not be aware, in the 1920s, we faced what was known as the Great Depression, the bank collapse. So the highest level of unemployment in the history of our country, which approached 24%. The Dust Bowl, an ecological collapse in the Midwest, productive farmland, which threw millions of people into poverty instantly and actually, greatly harmed the food supply of our country. And of course, the movement of the Nazis across Europe and their rise to power, culminating in World War II. So, if we look a generation ago, 100 years ago, there was an ecological imperative, a catastrophe happening in real time around us. There was an economic one, resulting in huge joblessness and the collapse of fundamental structures. And as we are facing now, militarism and war. And so, as a response, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed the New Deal, which proposed sweeping programs, everything from Social Security to healthcare to Tennessee Valley Authority to Civilian Conservation Corps. So these pillars of progressive era and liberal democracy in the United States. But fundamentally, it was putting the masses of people to work to rebuild infrastructure across the country. If you go to Pullen Park, if you're familiar with NC State's campus right across the street, you'll see bridges and picnic shelters and other structures that were built and constructed by everyday people who were involved in New Deal programs. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, arts, all kinds of things, but it was this national imperative to say that, hey, can we take this moment of crisis to radically rethink how we reorganize everything to push forward in a new direction. So the Green New Deal was inspired by the same idea. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who proposed House Resolution 109, not a bill, but a resolution proposing a Green New Deal. So taking the reality of the climate crisis we're all facing, the imperative of not hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040, to propose a massive rethink of how we think about business as usual for infrastructure and for energy in our country. So the 3 pillars of that House bill: jobs, justice, and decarbonization, and interestingly in that order. So if you ever read House Resolution 109, jobs came first, which is to say, and particularly labor. So what's happened in the past 50 years is sort of a dismantling of organized labor and the viability of blue collar work. And so the idea of how can we learn from the New Deal to think about climate adaptation and a conversion to renewable energy sources as an influx of resources to rebuild that infrastructure for everyday people. Justice, so environmental justice, how do we start to direct those resources in the communities that have been most harmed, particularly by the fossil fuel industry and its emissions? So environmental justice being one of the critical pillars. And of course, decarbonization. So this need to massively reduce our emissions to have any chance of affecting global climate change. This has divided us as a country, to put it mildly. The positive side, the Sunrise Movement and several other organizations The great Mayor Wu of Boston has full-throatedly embraced the Green New Deal and is infusing those principles to all the city policies. But on the other side, people who see it as a waste, as a threat to the economic stability of fossil fuel industries and the like. So no agreement right now on that path forward. So one of the reasons why we all convened last weekend was the culmination of about 2.5 years of work, was that it's hard for people to understand climate and the impacts of climate and the opportunities presented by the Green New Deal unless we start to visualize them as projects. If we start to look in our own backyard to see how we can think about what we do, infusing those 3 pillars of how do we think about projects now that could produce fair paying green collar jobs? How could we start to focus our work on those that are most marginalized and most vulnerable, particularly from the previous regime, and deal with those particular issues through projects? And how can we infuse innovations and decarbonization in that work as well? And for that reason, we began this process. It involved a lot of different ways of thinking. For a lot of us, we never really thought about policy. We think about it sometimes in terms of rules and laws. In our profession in landscape architecture, the most pervasive is probably universal design and ADA, accessibility guidelines required for people who don't have the same level of mobility. That infuses everything that we do. Everything else is sort of a grab bag of various things. So thinking about how design and policy connect was difficult. The nature of work and how that's changing. The scale of projects that we work on. An importance on housing, right? So it turns out that I'm a landscape architect, just teaching landscape architecture about how much housing, and in particular poorly designed housing, contributes to emissions and also broader systems of injustice. Knowledge about energy, knowledge about how we are actively engaged in the ecocide, where we're losing species are going extinct all the time, and so making that a part of what we push against, and that sense of urgency, right? That this could happen in a slow, iterative way, but the pressures for trying to hit this mark in a certain time frame is important. So facing all these challenges, Billy Fleming, who actually, along with Richard Weller, initially conceived the idea of the Green New Deal Super Studio. I'll explain why it's super in a second. But what I want to put in front of everybody is a proposition he made, which is the power of radical imagination. In all of those instances, we referenced the original New Deal. All the policies that were talked about, all the huge transformations in infrastructure weren't quote unquote practical or realistic. They were really bold. And even moving later to modern civil rights movement, the aspirations of the environmental justice movement, those weren't practical. They were bold. So the idea that if we find ourselves boxed into a lot of the pragmatic details sometimes of the nature of a problem, it's difficult to literally quote unquote think outside the box and come up with radically new ways to deal with them. So that's a proposition that Billy made. And that's what led to the Super Studio. Why is it super? Because we had 3,000 people. We had 200 institutions and probably 170 studios all working at the same time around the world on this. So I taught the one here at NC State, but there were many projects. And sadly, due to COVID, we were all on the screen, but positively due to COVID, we had an opportunity to actually collaborate and work collectively, even though we were in different places. So for the students here, for example, they got to work with students at Columbia, Washington University in St. Louis, and Harvard and Cornell, and UCLA and other places, right? Because it started to build this peer-to-peer network of people who were really thinking about how these broader principles applied, but really dealing with the particulars of their own backyard in terms of how they dealt with it. That's one map showing at least the United States, some of the projects that were there, but it was also in 17 different countries. So, there was a lot of work and connections happening while we were there. There were broader categories of it. So there are projects more focused on adaptation. So saying that, we need to prepare for sea level rise, for increased wildfires, all these other risks, but there are proactive things we can do to try and deal with that in healthful ways. Cultivation, so dealing with our food systems, dealing with how to think about the land in different ways. Empowerment, dealing with energy and rapid conversion to renewable resources and energize. Remediation, so repairing the harm done with toxics and other parts of the land, and retrofitting, which is sort of going into our existing communities and rethinking them, reshaping them, and remaking them to align with those particular goals. A few different projects that get to the radical imagination part of this. This one is from Methuen. Methuen is a prominent architecture firm, multidisciplinary firm based in Seattle with offices all over. This is from their San Francisco office, where they really focused on the workforce development aspect of the Green New Deal, and how do we really start to engage people and invest in people instead of just infrastructure as technology. Use the game example using playing cards, but all those images are actual people in the actual community who have roles. And part of what this team thought in terms of massive change was helping people understand in their midst are all the resources that they need in order to affect massive change, if they could get it together, if they could find ways to organize and move forward. They used a lot of really unconventional methods, but one thing that was really interesting about it is, if anybody ever wondered how a project comes to be, it goes through different phases, right? So there's an initial phase where you're trying to think about, what's possible. Ifeomo made a really great point in her lecture today about there's a difference between coming to somebody with something already thought about and trying to get their sort of acceptance versus co-creating and defining what needs to happen together. And so this idea of how you activate local people, in that particular process of defining what's important and what people really, really need in a particular place. The design and construction of it, right? So we made reference to 11th Street Bridge Park project several weeks ago in class as an example of, as we're thinking about equity and justice and how we execute projects, there are different phases. And so this idea of preparing a workforce so that they're able and ready to benefit, right, with actual jobs and implementing and transforming their own communities is an important factor. Same with design and construction, but one area that is really growing in a lot of cities is maintenance and care and operations. So after it's done, how do we start to grow the skills and capacities of people to actually maintain and deal with it? So, it was an interesting example of starting to, their theory of change was investing in people and preparing them to participate economically, educationally, ecologically in the transformation of their communities by really calling out those particular individuals. This one, in terms of a theory of change, really different in Richmond, California. In this one, they intentionally zoomed in on a site that had been a place of fossil fuel extraction with numerous negative outcomes from, diminished life expectancy, air quality, destruction of habitat. So in this way, it adjusted their lens, saying, what are the priority areas? How do I come up with a criteria for thinking about where we need to, really intervene? And that was there. Did a lot of projections, and what's interesting here is they projected to 2050. So they used existing information to kind of sketch out what they thought things would be like in a generation. Developed a baseline to help people understand what all of the issues are in that particular area. Proposed a radical rethinking of it that included phytoremediation, solar fields, floating neighborhoods. So in this case, they're accepting the fact that sea level rise is coming, and rather than hold that water back, adapting how communities could maintain some connection in place, even though in some cases they might be on water instead of land, and a number of other important comments. What was important about this, and what was a theme in some of them, and it's a theme for all of us moving forward, is taking measures. One of the themes of the conference was what persuades policymakers, what persuades investors. Some of that is metrics. So the idea that you come up with a baseline of how you think things are performing. In this case, energy, tree canopy, a number of other strategies, including land back. So part of this was also folding some of these strategies into returning land to indigenous people that were native to that particular area. What are the differences, the pluses and the minuses, the ability for someone to see this and see where the benefits are or could be. Those tools are extremely persuasive. So in this case, they relied on data as their theory of change, that taking measures of those matters. And speaking of indigenous people and indigenous practices, in terms of this one, the Jack and Laura Dangermond Preserve, the traditional lands of a number of people that had been exploited for extraction with different indicators. So the impacts of cattle and ranch infrastructure, piping that redirects water sources, and the proliferation of invasive plants, including olive trees from those native areas. And this one also a land back example, really starting to build a model, assuming that indigenous people who lived in some form of harmony on this site for generations before colonialism have cultural practices that require connection to the land. So the land back, land repatriation component, giving the land back, and really resourcing them to continue those indigenous practices, but using that as the inspiration connected with technical knowledge to learn from those indigenous practices so that they can scale up, which is to say, rather than deploying the technology that we have today, Western technology, Western ways of thinking about it, learning from the people who are indigenous to that particular area and figuring out how to scale up their practices. So in a sense, we would all be practicing indigenous practices through this particular model. So this idea of, in some cases, going beyond the constraints of what's possible now, to think big, to reframe it so that we can be more clear about the changes and their impacts is important. This is Kate Orff, who's the founder and director of SCAPE, world-renowned landscape architecture practice based in New York City, sitting next to Alexa Bush, who City of Detroit, but most recently is the Kresge Foundation director of programs there. Just a brilliant couple of people. Kate led the panel on implementation. So the other side of the coin, right? So Billy was more on the speculative, visionary side. Kate's on the side of, well, how do we actually get this stuff done? And we'll talk about one of her projects as an illustration of that. Because as Ifeomo also talked about, when she talked about moving at the speed of trust, there's sort of a tension, right? Meaning all the data is telling us if we don't get our act together by 2040 or 2042, we're going to have a whole different set of decisions to make as a planet about global climate change. So there's a sense of urgency built into the idea of the Green New Deal, saying that a lot of these impacts we have to be able to feel by 2042. On the other side, though, as Ifeomo mentioned, there are mechanistic top-down technology-driven strategies that sometimes are moving too quickly, that ignore community voices and the need for community empowerment, that are out of balance. And so reconciling these two in real time is a real challenge. And so that panel kind of dug in on that particular topic. I'm going to skip that one. This one starts with sort of an out of the box kind of idea, but then illustrates sort of the challenge as you start to deal with time. Kate did a speculative project after Superstorm Sandy in New York City that she called oyster texture, where she started to study the life cycle and environmental conditions of oysters and how, particularly in the Hudson River and the East River, sort of destruction of oyster habitat. Part of Superstorm Sandy was a storm surge, right? The idea that all this water came through and inundated these communities, but discovered that, you know, the kinds of habitats that attract oysters not only help to clean the water and sort of had multiple benefits, could reignite local sort of water-based economies, fishermen, tourism, all that stuff. But they could also work as breakwaters, right? To slow the movement of water. So in that inundation, they can slow that water, which would decrease the risk of flooding due to storm surge. So started as sort of dreaming big and looking at, you know, how these oysters could play that role. Did a lot of work on the life cycle of them, the role of habitat, the connections to other parts of society. Got a MacArthur grant, Genius Foundation grant. She was the first landscape architect to get that for this particular speculative work, and started to advance it, like prototype it, test it out, attract more attention, did a big exhibit in the gallery talking about how this works as a model, and eventually got federal funding to implement it. So they're literally in the process of implementing this now. Living Breakwaters project, about $100 million worth of restoration of oyster habitat that has all these far-reaching benefits, right? So habitat protection from storm surge, equity in terms of access to environmental education, new jobs, supporting new businesses that are tied to that piece. And of course, all these folks working as they're starting to deploy all these structures right now out in the river. So what Kate was talking about, which was interesting, was it took 12 years to get to this point. And this was expedited. So this was a fast track project, but at the scale and the magnitude that we're dealing with, the pace of change is just really hard to deal with and to grapple with. And it was really a humbling kind of conversation, right? In terms of what are the things that we do at multiple layers to kind of make this happen. We spend a lot of time talking about existing policy and funding mechanisms. So the idea that holding on to these values of equity and justice, but also looking at them through the lens of resources that fund them. BRIC, which is a new grant program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, gives a lot of latitude, right? It's federal funding, but is directed to states and local communities to deploy for dealing with resilience work. And this rising interest in coupling that with issues of social equity and environmental justice. They're on, I think, round 2 coming up, but then that first round, Lumberton, North Carolina got a BRIC grant, largely due to the efforts of Andy Fox and Travis Klondike and all the good people at Coastal Dynamics Design Lab, who've been working with the town of Lumberton for a number of years to help them prepare for that. But it's a recurring set of funding that can activate projects. And so part of the conversation became readiness. The idea that when these resources come to bear, and Kate would say that even with Living Breakwaters and oyster texture, it was kind of evolving over time. But if it was at a state of readiness, when these resources came, maybe they could have cut that time frame down. And with the federal government also investing in what are called nature-based solutions. So instead of just putting up walls and other ways to block things, you know, looking at living systems as ways to deal with the challenges of stormwater and flooding. The president, in his first week of office, President Biden, issued an executive order called Justice 40. The idea that 40% of renewable energy infrastructure should be targeted in communities that they call disadvantaged, but we'll call marginalized communities, particularly those marginalized by fossil fuel extraction, and issued that mandate to every federal agency. They had to come back to the president and talk about a plan for how they wanted to make sure that 40% of those resources are going to those places. So this idea of being aware of that, right, and being able to connect issues of equity and justice to energy, and to preparing communities to participate effectively in the new energy economy is another example of readiness, which leads to a new tool. This has happened since we started this class. So we did an exercise with EJ Screen, Environmental Justice Screen, so the online tool that allows you to read the United States through the lens of the Office of Environmental Justice in terms of what they identify as risks and factors. And it's not exhaustive, it's not thorough. I think Michaela and other people were highly critical of it, rightfully so. But they have a new tool now because they have to figure out how to deploy what communities are eligible, who meets that 40% guideline. So that little small map on the left, everything that's in gray meets that guideline. But what's interesting about it is that they removed race as a factor in analyzing environmental justice. Race is not a factor anymore. They did add some. So there's a lot more emphasis on public health. There's a lot more emphasis on poverty and other indicators, but race doesn't matter anymore to the federal government's definition of environmental justice. As you might imagine, this has led to some divergent points of view. So Catherine Coleman Flowers, also MacArthur Genius Grant winner, author of a book called Waste, which really talks about the horrible disparities in sanitary sewer infrastructure in rural Alabama, where she's from, who teams and partners regularly with Duke University. Is on the White House Advisory Council for Environmental Justice, and in her words, thinks it's a good start, understands the idea that race is not the main factor, that there are other factors that are marginalizing communities. Jacoby Wilson, who's a faculty member at Maryland, who has an environmental justice lab, is highly critical, says it was a political decision, not one that's based on data or facts or scientific information. And of course, the guy that started it all is really upset about it. He was on the advisory council as well, Bob Bullard. If we go way back to where environmental justice came from, started as environmental racism because it came out of the systematic analysis of the correlation between race and proximity to toxics, which he authored with his wife. So he's actually leading at Texas Southern an audit of this new tool to see what the disparities are going to be. There are a lot of people who think that race is a proxy for a lot of other social ills, but in his case, the foundations of at least his scholarship and a lot of pioneers in this movement was that correlation with race. So removing it, looking at other factors is a big deal. It's one of those things moving forward as we start to evaluate and analyze things that become important. So I say all that to say that in real time this past weekend was an attempt to figure out, well, what do we do about it? Well, one thing for sure is, Ifeomo talked about essentially finding her tribe, finding her group, right? So I would encourage you all to find your group. This was our attempt to find our group, right? Where we said, we know that a lot of people, especially 2 years ago, weren't really focused on these particular issues, but there are people in different places. And we found out that there were a lot more than we thought. There were 3,000 people. That's a lot of people. Then it's sort of this balancing act, right? Where even though we aren't trained in design, we're all creative people. So how do we put ourselves and communities in a position where they can have that radical imagination? Where they can dream big, even if it means pushing beyond the boundaries of what's known. And on the other side, how do we consider that pace of change, right? What's the right rate that we need to go in order to have impact. What's the right information to get, who are the right relationships to build with, what are the resources that are available. It's challenging us all to have a skill set that's much broader than we thought we needed. But the good news is that we're not alone. There are a lot of people talking about this right now, and hopefully including you. We're going to close out with a few thoughts on dangling sort of issue that we didn't get a chance to fully address. One is the story map. So I know that Chancellor C has done his, did his in January, no pressure to the rest of you all. We'll look at it in a second. Had a couple questions about what needs to be on it. Well, I think it'd be great to have an image of the case study with some descriptive text. I think that would be great. I think it'd be great to have a little bit of context of where this place is. I think it'd be great to identify the equity issue that you're addressing. I think it'd be great to have a slide that talks about strategies that you're deploying. And I think if you're using anybody else's stuff, photos, text, to have something that shows references. So for folks who are wondering about that, that would be my vote. We will look at the Chancellor's work right now. From the example that we shared from the exercise, Partners for Environmental Justice, we got a little vertical alignment issue. It's cutting people's eyes off, but we'll let that slide for right now. But some kind of image when you're greeted on this particular page, right, that captures it. The way that Story Maps works is it allows you to bring multiple sources of information together. So that map on the left with the blue box is something that you can do literally within the application itself. And this left boundary, you can see how it's sliding and moving. That allows you to add text, incorporate images, do your thing. So in this case, Partners for Environmental Justice story starts with its location and the fact that Rochester Heights is the first post-war historic district of an African-American community in the state, definitely in the city of Raleigh. Some image here that shows, the issue. So flooding, particularly this was Walnut Creek after Hurricane Floyd. And this is more of an historic one. This is the exercise that was assigned. This is not the case study analysis that you're doing, but it's just designed to just show you the interface and how it works. This describes all the partners. You'll recognize, for people in the College of Design, Robin Moore over on the right, who was instrumental to the changes that happened there. Mayor Meeker in the middle, Norman Camp, the founder of Partners for Environmental Justice, in the middle. And all the way on the left, who you might not recognize, is Bill Flournoy. Bill Flournoy, alumni of our program, our Master's Landscape Architecture program, whose master's thesis was the Capital Area Greenway. The Greenway system in Raleigh came out of a grad student master's thesis. So for anybody that uses that today, tip of the cap to Bill. So it shows that you can do transitions, you can do sweeps, you can do swipes, you can do all kinds of stuff. That shows you the center. That's Amin Davis, who's the current director of Partners for Environmental Justice, who I think when we went out there for our field study was referenced. We didn't get a chance to meet him, but he's out there with the kids, teaching about all the critters. That's the Bailey Street Gateway project, which is the latest version of work in that particular area that's being led by Design Workshop. There's an example of one of the workshops. So for people who did the extra, and this is an example of references. So if you see on the left, in this case, there are only 2 links to several stories. So the content is different from what you all have to do, but I wanted to show the format. So little bits of text, not a lot of text. Images that represent the different components. And the interface is pretty straightforward. So I would go to the file, that problem statement walks you through how to set up a free account. It's free, doesn't require information. Where to place it. The folder where this exists is also has all the assets for this particular exercise. So if you want to test it out before you commit to doing your own, all the assets are there for you. You'll be able to do it, even some of the quotes. So salute to Chancellor C. Well, no salute to Chancellor C. He hasn't done his case study yet. So I take that salute back. Unsalute, reverse, whatever reverse salute is. That's what I do. Right. All right. Next time I see y'all, we'll be in panel mode. So it's the last class.
Well,
Kofi. Oh, I'm sorry. You can go, Megan. Okay.
Wow, Zoom has not gotten any less awkward. I'm so sorry. I was just wondering if all these resources like the readings and the lectures will still be available to us after this class has ended.
Yes. It's breaking several NC State rules, but there's no security on the Google Drive. And for that matter, for any of the sessions of this class. So if you wanted to go back in the past and see what's happened before, you can type in the same class number and change the year. I think everything up until another last 4 years for sure for online. But yes, however, if it was me, I would download like crazy, the stuff I wanted to hold on to. But just so you know, there's no passwords or securities right now locking this stuff up. It's open. Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, so some of the people in our panel, including myself, were wondering, like, so next week when we present, the panels will have like 20 minutes with about like 5 minutes for each person to talk about their case study. In those group presentations, do you want us, like, I know in the mid panels, we were trying to like find connections between our case studies. Is that something we should be still trying to talk about in our presentation, or should it just be focused on each of us like going through it in a linear order, I guess?
It's up to you. I think with more focused discussion on your case studies, you could probably still have some conversation about things that are similar and things that are different. I think the really good panels, and Joe, you saw a few this weekend, are when we didn't get into it, right? So we were lucky. There was a lot of groupthink in those panels this weekend where everybody was kind of like agreeing with everybody. But sometimes it's good, like when, someone responds to someone else's presentation. So I'm leaving it loose. I know that's frustrating for some of you, but I think that the reason why I gave individual feedback on your individual cases is I think if you tightened up how you talked about those, it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with your panelists about these broader issues. So my vote would be maybe reduce the amount of that in terms of discussing what's in common, discussing what's different, but it's still there. I think what's most important is finding a way to be able to talk about with some clarity what you're intending to do, but then to have a way to have something that other people could contribute to if they wanted to. So I apologize for the breadth of that, but I'm hoping that that leads to some diversity in terms of how different groups decide to pursue it. I think it's a shame if y'all just talk side by side, especially on Zoom. That's really boring. It'd be great if there were things that you all could coordinate. So I'd say be creative. Yeah.
Thank you.
Others. Okay. If you hit a wall, an impasse, have a question, get confused, please reach out. Email is the fastest way to catch me. I'll try and respond as soon as I can. My life is a bit simpler now that the summit's over, so I should be able to respond a little bit quicker. But I want to encourage you to, if you do, either as a group or individually, still have questions, want to bounce an idea off of another person, please feel free to reach out. And I would say also reach out to your classmates too. I mean, this is a chance to really leverage the brain trust that's in here. You know, I mean, these are really hard people to impress. Like these people I've invited to speak in the class, every last one of them was like, those questions are so good. I was like, y'all just shut up for a second. They're not that good. I mean, they're all right, but you know. But no, they're not like effusive, like praising type people. So I think that's should give you a little bit of confidence that you got some horsepower. So in addition to seeking out, if there's confusion or questions, I would say seek out feedback from your classmates as well. Y'all are really smart. All right.